Okay, thanks everyone. This is the fourth time we've tried. Thank you very much for Andrea for your time and patience. Andrea's having issues hearing me. I can hear Andrea fine, so what we're going to do is Karen's going to message Andrea the questions and she's going to answer me. In the meantime, if any of the viewers have got any questions, they can message.
If I'm understanding you correct, you're telling me that you're going to type the questions into the Facebook and then I am going to answer them from there. Okay, good. All right, because, we can beat the electronics and the technology if we put our heads together. We'll be good.
That's the first one sent, Andrea.
Okay, let me go back to Facebook and see if I can. Okay, what age were you when your family moved to the Arnold estate? Oh, that's an easy one. Oh my gosh. Okay. I was 12 years old when we moved to the farmhouse, and I'm 58 years old now. And I can't tell you if I know any more now about what we saw there than I did when I first saw my first full-body apparition, which was on the day that we moved into the farmhouse. We had been to the house a number of times prior to buying it, and none of us remember having any odd or strange experiences. But the day we moved in, I saw an apparition that appeared to me to be so solid that I greeted him as I walked past him, and then asked my mother when I went to the kitchen who that man was in the dining room that was dressed funny, because I was a child and I didn't realize that he was dressed with clothing from the 1800s. So he was there apparently to say his own goodbye to the owner of the house. As we were moving in, Mr. Kenyon was moving out. And he looked right through me like I was a ghost. He could not see me at all. He was fixated on watching Mr. Kenyon. And I was 12, and my baby sister April was 5. I'll always be grateful for the experience of the 10 years that we spent at the farmhouse, because my baby sister April passed away 5 months ago.
Really sorry to hear that.
She was just a few weeks shy of 52, and she took her prescribed medication, and it stopped her heart, which was devastating to my entire family. But I don't weep about it in the same way anymore. I think I've cried all my tears, although they can come spontaneously at any moment. But I can't say, David, that if I had not grown up the way that I did, if I had not been touched by spirit at such a young age, I don't know if I would have recognized what was happening when April came to visit all of us after her death. And so in that respect, I think that to be touched by spirit is truly a blessing, because I don't know exactly what it was that we saw at the farmhouse. We, of course, make assumptions. Yes, that's a ghost or a spirit, or, I can see right through it. It's not alive. It's in another realm. It's not, in our world. But I know that it wasn't, I don't know what it was, but I know what it wasn't. And it wasn't a mass hallucination. Yeah. It was not a figment of imagination. It was not, it was real. It was absolutely real, and there were many spirits in the house, and every one of us had numerous interactions and altercations over the years. And it was really a miraculous thing, because what's the one fear that keeps people up in the middle of the night is the fear of death. And the reason that people fear death is because they fear the unknown. And if they know that it's not a question of faith or belief, it's a question of knowledge, And if they know that there is something beyond our mortal existence, and that how we comport ourselves in this life does matter in terms of our being able to go on and, go to the light, or, whatever we call it, whatever phraseology we use, I think that that's a comforting thing. I know that it was for me. David, when I saw that man, and I realized when my sister Nancy came in, Christine came in right behind me in the kitchen, and she had seen him. Cindy saw him. Nancy saw him. And the only reason that April didn't see him was because she was in the kitchen with my mom. She was too little to be helping unpack the van. So she was helping unpack boxes in the kitchen. And the thing that was most fascinating about it was that at one point, Nancy came into the kitchen and she said that there was a man with Mr. Kenyon, but he just disappeared. Well, about an hour later, he came back while all of us were standing in the dining room, and my father wasn't standing 2 to 3 feet away from him, and my dad didn't see him, and all the rest of us did. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm going to cover that point that says, once
use sign language, because I can't hear a word you're saying, which is so cruel and unkind of the universe to deprive me of that robe. It's just wrong. It's wrong. So, all right. So, I'm going to go back to Facebook.
Yep.
Ask me your next question. Okay?
Yeah, I was just saying
that. Oh, my God. Hey, this is the mother of invention. We are the mother and father of invention getting this job done right now. Hold on.
Go to that third one?
Yeah, go to the
Okay.
Yep.
All right. We covered what age was I when your family moved to the Arnold estate. Yes.
Karen's going to write the second one.
I know what you're talking about, because for you to refer to it as the Arnold estate means that you have done your homework.
Yeah.
And I so appreciate that, because you don't know how many interviews I do where people think that they take the Conjuring literally, and it's a product of Hollywood, or as I like to call it, Hollyweird.
Yeah.
And they literally conjured up that story in the minds of screenwriters, because when they had the real stuff, and had 2 of the 3 books, were already in the public domain when they started filming, the screenwriters wanted to use real elements of our story, and the movie producers, the big guys at Warner Brothers said, this will scare people right out of the theater, tone it down. I think it's the only time in Hollywood filmmaking history that they actually, instead of exaggerating something, they had to bring it down to a story down to something that was more palpable for people. Okay, let me read your next question. Do you feel the house was a portal to the spirit world, or that the veil between the living and spirit world was thinner there? You ask fantastic questions. That's a great question. Okay, I'm coming back to you. Hold on, I'm coming back to you. Full screen here. There you go. Yes. I think that the house is a portal that's cleverly disguised as a farmhouse. I mean, it was, it's proof of multiple dimensions, and I'll tell you why. My mother was having a difficult time. Let me say goodbye to my sister. Bye, honey. Bye.
Bye.
She's going back to work. My mom was having a very difficult time. In the movie The Conjuring, there's an exorcism. Well, there was no exorcism in our house. My mother was not possessed. My mother was attacked by something that Lorraine Warren and her friend the medium invited into the house as they were trying to determine who the culprit was, something that I consider to be spiritual malpractice. I don't think that anybody did anything deliberately to try to hurt myself or my family. I think that they were just ignorant of the process and what was going on, and how disturbingly intense it could get in that house. They didn't know. We did, but they didn't know. And, after that, my mother almost paid with her life. That night was horrific. It was the most frightening, horrifying thing I have ever seen in my life. Way worse than anything that you've seen in The Conjuring. about 3 months later, she got up at about 11 o'clock at night, and I was 15 years old at the time, probably close to turning 16, and she got up and she asked for some dinner and what I had made for the girls, for my sisters, and I walked through. I told her I was happy to get her some dinner, but of course it was before the days of microwaves and stuff like that, so I had to walk from the parlor, through the dining room, through the front foyer, through the kitchen, into the pantry in order to prepare food for my mom at 11 o'clock at night. She turned around. She was standing on the hearthstone of the fireplace, and she turned around to throw a big log on, one last log for the night. She was putting the screen back up in front of it, and she heard laughter behind her. And she turned and looked into our dining room, and there was an entire family that was sitting having dinner in our dining room. Now, keep in mind, I'm on the other side of the house. I'm like 100 feet away from her or more, and just heating up beef stew and making a short pot of coffee for her as she asked. So I didn't know anything that was going on, and I didn't hear anything either. So she just looked at them, and she said, the room was completely lit with candles and oil lamps. There were large pewter steins, 2 pewter steins in front of 2 men that were sitting on one side of the table that was not our own. It was a hand-hewn oak table with benches on both sides. There was a woman cooking a stew of her own over the fireplace, and this fireplace had been closed more than 100 years before we bought the house. It was completely sealed shut. There was no center chimney left. She was telling her children to go sit down and have their dinner. The pewter steins are indicative of the 1700s because, of course, they were outlawed in the 1800s because of the lead content, and they were literally killing people. So that kind of gauged for her what time frame she was looking at. Plus, she said all their clothes were obviously homemade. And the 2 men were sitting side by side on the bench, and one of them glanced into the parlor, and he made direct eye contact with my mother, who was standing on the hearthstone. And then he nudged the guy next to him, and he pointed her out.
Intelligence.
She was the ghost. She was the ghost.
Yeah.
They were looking into the future as she was simultaneously looking into the past. Now, I can't explain exactly why. There are a lot of people who work in this field that think perhaps it was because there were aquifers running beneath the property and a lot of water around it, lots and lots of springs and rivers and lakes and ponds and, a lot of water on the property. And there was also an open well in the cellar of the house. And that very often will attract. It's kind of like a highway for spirit. It seems to be. Anyway, it's easier for them to travel that way. And everything's energy.
If there's any limestone on the...
like water conducts electricity.
Yep.
Everything is energy. So it would stand to reason. It hasn't been proved scientifically one way or the other, but it certainly is a plausible explanation. But what we discovered living at the farm was that there's an air of timelessness about it. That we're actually living in multiple centuries at the same time. And we're living with, the house was really crowded, David, no kidding. Yeah. And as big as that house was, you'd think, oh yeah, plenty of room for everybody. But there were times when, all hell would break loose in that house and things were floating around and flying around and doors were slamming and lights on and off. And, my sisters had some very close encounters that were very disquieting, very disconcerting to them. I never had that problem. The spirit that went after my mother, who, by the way, was not Bathsheba Sherman. Yeah. Mrs. Warren is the one who said that it was Bathsheba Sherman. But she was wrong. The woman who actually had passed away and was haunting and taunting my mother was very likely long dead before Bathsheba was even born in 1812. I'm not saying that Bathsheba was necessarily the nicest spirit in the afterlife, And she had her own issues, and I write about all of that at length in my books. But I also wanted to make it very clear that throwing the word witch around could cost you your life, and for hundreds and hundreds of years has cost tens of millions of people their lives around the world. And, I think she probably suffered enough in life, and she does not need to be indicted and punished in her afterlife. And so, though I don't have any plausible deniability about the stories that we were told about her and the things that happened with her, I think that she should be given the benefit of the doubt, and she is very appreciative of that. I've been in contact with her on several different, in several different ways, but predominantly through the spirit box. And it's interesting, too, because when I was doing a spirit box session one time with my friend George Lopez, who I wrote in a Flickr with, I have to tell you about that, too, but before we're done, I have to tell you about that. He asked her, well, first of all, when she came through, she threw my voice. And he's like, absolutely not. You use your own voice. If you want to communicate with us, you must use your own voice. And then immediately came through the voice of what sounded almost like a child. And that was the voice that I recognized. She was quite diminutive in stature. She was quite a small person. And she had almost the voice of a child. And when that came through, it was like, boom, I recognized it right away. I said, George, that's her. And he said, Bathsheba, what one word do you associate with Andrea? And immediately came back, love. Because I was her great defender. I was the one that said, do not cast aspersions on this woman. You did not know her. There's nothing in the records that would be indicative of someone practicing witchcraft or a murderess. That was, and that's the power of words. The power of words. What she was accused of in life followed her in death. And I wanted to dispel that and at least bring it to people's attention that, when you accuse somebody of something, you'd better have some evidence before you make that accusation stick. So, sorry, little dog. Mom, make that little dog hush. Samuel, zip it. Mommy's on the phone, sort of. Okay, so, anyway, I got off track. I'm sorry, I do that all the time. You need one of those hooks to ring me back in, Yes, exactly. Okay, so all right, just nod, yes or no. Did I answer your question? Portal, yes, got it. Okay, next question. I'm going to Facebook. I'll go find it. Hold on, let's see what we got going on Facebook. Okay, do you think having children and teenagers in the house led to an increase in the activity? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. I think that that's a very important question to ask and to answer. Because as I mentioned before, everything, absolutely everything, is energy. And when you bring 5 little tomboys into a house and unleash them on 200 acres of property with all the energy that we bring to the equation, I think that, yes, that did have. Now, there have been reports of hauntings in that house way before we moved there and subsequently. So I'm not going to say that. I will tell you that none of us had any paranormal experiences prior to moving to the farm. After we left the farm, it never stopped. Because once that door is open, it can never be closed again. A human mind expanded cannot retract. And once you have been touched by spirit, you might as well just consider it a permanent part of your life. You can turn your back on it and pretend it doesn't exist, but eventually it will reach through that door and tap you on the shoulder and make its presence known. So best to accept it and to embrace it and to understand that you are being given a great gift of knowledge.
Yeah, but it's like switching a light on.
Okay. All right. Ask me my next question.
Okay.
Tell your wife she's got to stay right on the stick here. You know? Exactly. Hold on. That gives me a chance to wet my whistle here. family spirits in the house. Absolutely. Well, I did tell you first and foremost about the one that we met the day we moved in. Hold on, it's very hot here in Georgia. I'm in Georgia right now. And even with the air pumping, it's very hot and humid today. I know, you never get hot and humid where you are, hardly at all. I know, but I'm melting. What a world, what a world. The one that my sister named Manny, because she wasn't very creative in terms of naming. She had no idea. I mean, honestly, my sister started naming them like pets because they didn't, they had to be able to refer to them in some way, shape, or form. As I said earlier, I never had an altercation or a problem with them. It wasn't that they didn't express themselves to me, but I didn't feel any fear. I felt like, dare I say, one of them. My mother always said that she felt certain that they bought that house for me. And that is because when I was 17 years old, I came home from college for my birthday weekend, which always falls on the Columbus Day holiday, almost always, October 10th. And I had just gone off to college like 6 weeks before. I was miserable. I hated it. I wanted to come home and be with my family and my friends and my ghosts and my farm, and I just wanted to, this is the worst mistake I ever made in my life. And interestingly, the college that I went off to was 666 miles from door to door. No kidding. No kidding. Anyway, that aside, I digress, which is so typical, honest to God. So anyway, I came home for my 18th birthday, and I had a close encounter with a spirit on the hearthstone again, which was a very, very active part of the house. And I turned and looked at this apparition, and she was the spitting image of me as an old woman. In other words, she looked a lot like I do now. Oh. And she was dressed in a beautiful dress that had big leg of mutton sleeves and the pearls, going down the side, and a full-length dress. And she had this big, thick hair, only it was longer, and it was all wrapped in a bun. And I looked into her face, and I looked into a mirror image reflection of myself as an old woman.
Wow.
And I think that's why. And they can play with us, and they can make images that aren't necessarily real. But I felt a connection. I felt. I can't even explain how deep the connection was. I had no fear of her at all. That would be like saying I was afraid of myself. But I didn't tell my mom until, everybody in the family saw her, but no one saw her face except me. And I didn't tell everybody that she looked just like me because I didn't want them to carry that burden. I didn't want them to feel like we were, all going to have to live over and over and over again in this house in multiple dimensions or whatever. What was the connection? There was no ancestral connection between the family, the extended family that lived in the house, and our family. None. But there was some connection. I still can't explain it. It still had a lot to do with my research, my own personal work in the field. But I would say that Manny, who we think was Johnny Arnold, was very peaceful, very sweet, had a quirky grin. He had very weathered skin, like he'd spent an awful lot of time in the sun as a farmer over the years. And was dressed in, with obviously clothes from the 1800s. And he was very sweet. And he showed up, he was right there the day that we moved in, and he showed up on the day that we moved out and did to us what he also did to Mr. Kenyon, which was kind of come watch him, come say goodbye, watch him pack. the one spirit that I was most enamored with was an older woman. We don't know who she was, and she would make the rounds of the bedrooms upstairs at night, and she would lean over and almost kiss us on the forehead. Almost. You could almost feel it, but not quite. And we knew that it wasn't our mom, because mom always smelled like ivory soap. She always smelled clean and fresh and like she just stepped out of a spring shower. And this woman smelled of flowers and fruit, a very strange, very aromatic, sweet combination of aromas. And we felt so loved by her, very loved by her. There was also a man that we don't know for sure, but might have been Mr. Kenyon, that would come stand in the doorway between the bedrooms and just kind of guard us. He would just guard us, you know? So, I mean, we had some very tender, very endearing connections with the spirits. It wasn't all doom and gloom, which is why my mother came to me when I was about 300 or 400 pages into telling this story, what became 3 books later on. And she said to me one day, she said, "Sweetheart, what are you going to call this? You've been working and working. She's like, do you have a working title?" And I said, "No, actually, Mom, I hadn't even thought of it yet." And she just crossed her arms and she said, "House of Darkness, House of Light." It was both. So Mom named it.
Good name.
My girl, and they're watching the news that could make your brains explode in America right now. I'm telling you, I hope you've got a spare room, because I can't take much more of this, honest to God.
Welcome anytime.
Okay, good. So did I answer your question? I mean, there were several. April's little guy friend, her little boyfriend, Oliver Richardson, that's what he told her his name was. And he was a very reticent child. He would crawl up next to her out of the eaves when she was playing in what we called the chimney closet, which, remember I told you before, the center chimney had been taken out and a smaller chimney had been put in, and that had happened probably about 100 years before we bought the house. And so there was, the space left was called the chimney closet. And it was because the smaller vent was from the heating system. It was one of the few really warm places in the house. So we had its counterpart, which was what we called the warm room, which was down in the kitchen, right off the bathroom. And then right above it was the chimney closet between the bedrooms. And he would crawl out, and he would always look over his shoulder like he was scared, he was frightened, or like he was being followed by someone. That was her interpretation of it anyway. I'm so glad that she survived long enough to be able to truly tell her story, that I was able to get it in print, you know, to have her essay and her story out into the world, because this was a collective memoir. It was the stories that came from all of us, all 7 of us. So I'm grateful for that. I am. But she loved him. She loved him. And he would sit there and he would play with her, and he would pick up her toys and just turn them over in his hands, in little tiny hands. She said he was so tiny, and he was maybe 5 or 6 years old, so he was right around her age. So he felt safe to show himself to her. And he would sit down on the floor. He would sit down on his shins. And she said that his shoes had holes in them where his little toes would stick out. And sometimes he would shiver, like, you know, he was just so cold. And she would kind of scooch over next to him to give him some body heat. And he would just sit there and watch her play with her toys. And she said that he never spoke aloud to her, but that telepathically she asked him aloud what his name was. And what came back to her was Oliver Richardson. And we looked and looked for a gravestone for him. And I know it's right around there. I know that it is. It's probably in the old Arnold Cemetery. but those tombstones are so buried in debris, just natural debris, that it would take an awful lot of work to reclaim and, that cemetery. I hope to do that someday. Go in there with a whole team and really clean it up and, photograph everybody that's in there and all of that, because, that was originally part of the property. It's well more than a mile away from the house. But when that property was actually deeded, it was thousands of acres. When we bought it, it was 200 acres. So much had been sold off over the centuries. But, yes, I would say that the old woman, and the one that we called the kitchen witch, she was very kind. And she used to, and we stopped calling her that because our mother told us that that was disrespectful. And I think as children, we just kind of liked the alliteration of it. We meant no disrespect and certainly meant no harm. But my mom did a lot of research on the house, and she said that there's a possibility that was Harmony Arnold, who had died at the house, but there was no cause of death listed. So we don't know how she died, if it was in childbirth or if it was, making candles or, anything. It was not an easy life. Coming from the UK and the incredible history of, I think that's why people in the UK are so much more sophisticated about spirit activity, supernatural activity, because you live in houses that are 500, 600, 700 years old. How many times have people died in those houses? I'm sure some of them never left, in the same way that, we had 8 generations lived and died in our house before we moved in, and some of them didn't leave, or they came back to visit regularly. So, it just seems that the people of the UK are just very accepting of it. It's just part of life, as death is part of life. But to know that there is an afterlife, and to know, there was nothing insidious or malevolent about several of the spirits, especially the children. The children were just so sweet and innocent. My sister Cindy had a little girl that used to walk through her room and would cry for her mother. And Cindy said it just would break her heart to hear this child crying. And when she would walk through, she had a pinafore on. Women, you might not know what that is, but the women will know. It's kind of like a fancy apron with eyelets.
Oh, okay.
And she was wearing that, and she had long sleeves, and she had a little tissue slipped up under her sleeve, which a lot of girls did at that time, or a little handkerchief. And she always carried a book in her hands. And Cindy saw her. I said, Cindy, as I'm writing the books, I'm like, Cindy, how many times did you see the little girl? She's like, she just looked at me and she said, Anne, I don't know how many. Hundreds? Thousands? I'm like, okay, so basically you're telling me she lived with us. And she said, yes, she lived with us. There were scary moments too. Excuse me, just a second. Let me get done. There we go. When we first moved into the house, Cindy never saw any apparitions about this or around her bed, but she heard voices, and they all spoke together, and they all said in unison, there are 7 dead soldiers buried in the wall. There are 7 dead soldiers buried in the wall. And, Cindy was 8 years old when we moved into the house. Had just turned 8. She was a little bit. And that scared the bejesus out of her. And she thought she would just come, barreling into my room and crawl into bed with me, and I'll protect her, I'll take care of her. I didn't know what I was protecting her from. I didn't know what was going on. But when you think about the fact that that house, as it stands now, was completed in 1736, it was 40 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That house went through the Revolutionary War, the Civil War. It was part of the Underground Railroad, because the Arnold family were Quakers. They were abolitionists, and so they helped an awful lot of people escape to Canada. I mean, when you think of the souls that passed through that house, it's no wonder it's haunted. It's no wonder there's that kind of residual energy left behind. Okay, did I answer your whole question?
Yeah, that was great.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Okay, let me go look for the next one. And let me know how long we have, because I get all caught up in these things, and I'm so thrilled to be with you that I'll lose track of time entirely.
As long as you want, Andrea. I'll be here until 3 in the morning, whatever, just as long as you want. Really enjoyed hearing your story and listening to your experiences.
Okay, all right, I'm going to look for a question. Okay, can you tell us more about the negative spirits and some of the activity? Yes. I think that there was one spirit in the house that was, I don't even like to label them as positive or negative, in the same way that I wouldn't want to label any human being as we all have some of both in us, a little good, a lot of good, a little evil. There's it's the nature of humanity. I understand the question, however. In terms of behavior, negative behavior, I would say that there was one particular spirit that approached my mother several times, and also my sister Cindy, and also my sister Christine. I saw her one time, but I saw her the first time that she came to my mom, and she was hovering over her in her bed downstairs, and I was upstairs in my bed, and I was paralyzed. I could not move. I remember tears trickling out of the sides of my eyes. I remember feeling like the weight of the world was compressed on my chest, like something was sitting on me, or I could not breathe, I could not move, and I could hear my mother screaming. I knew she wasn't screaming aloud. I could hear her in my mind screaming. And my mother and I have a very, very profound connection. We always have a psychic connection that is really amazing. So I'm not surprised that happened. But Christine had a very close encounter with her. Cindy did as well. And she came to my mother twice. And she was hideous to look at, honestly. David, honestly, she was hideous.
Yeah.
She clearly had a broken neck. Her whole head was hanging off the side of her shoulders. She had a head that looked like a desiccated hornet's nest. It's like the layer of filmy stuff that you can peel back. No hair, but sprigs of hair coming off her skull. Very, very thin lips and jagged yellow teeth, 2 holes for nostrils, and 2 hollow black eyes, or the eyes were gone. And when she would come to my mother, she would come and hover over her. And the first time that she did, as she was doing so, her arm just fell down onto the pillow next to my mother. And literally, my mother said she was in solid form. It made an impression in the pillow. But she had no feet. She floated. And she didn't have fingers, per se. Mom said it looked like drawn, rendered bone. Like boiled bone was coming out of the end of her sleeves. My mother remembers every single detail, from the lace collar, the high lace collar, to the belt, to the pockets on her dress, to the color of the fabric, to the fabric itself. She was right in her face. And she threatened her. And I wrote the whole thing. I don't have the book handy right now. I can't read it directly to you. But she uttered a threat to her. Not the first time that she came, the second time came. And she said, "'Twas mistress once afore ye came, and mistress here will be anon. will drive ye out with fiery broom, will drive ye mad with death and gloom. It was a very long incantation. I wrote the whole thing into the book. It was retrieved from my mother through hypnosis. My mother said she will never be hypnotized again. She had to relive that entire ordeal through the hypnosis. She came out of it remembering everything. It was a very traumatic event. She said, no more, no more. Anybody doesn't believe me, she doesn't care. She has nothing to prove to anyone. She's going to be 78 years old next week. She's been to hell and back in this life. She's survived things you cannot even imagine. And she doesn't care who believes her or not, or any of us, really. So, I give her a lot of credit for that because she's the strongest person I know. She's my hero, and she's my best friend. So I know I got off track again. I do this all the time. But I think in terms of negative energy spirits, she was the one. And I really do think, David, that the reason that she behaved the way that she did was she was probably one of the original, if not the original mistress of the house. And actually, she spoke with a little bit of a brogue. They were from England, and the Richardson family. And then the Richardsons married into the Arnolds, and then it became the Arnold estate. But it was actually built by the Richardsons that followed Roger Williams down from the Massachusetts Bay Colony after he was thrown out in the winter of 1635. And they followed him down. And once he established the colony of Rhode Island, Bathsheba was not an Arnold, even though we were originally told that she was. She was actually born of a union of the Taft and the Thayer families, were both very wealthy, people of means. Two of the oldest names in Rhode Island, streets named after them, colleges named after them, big deal. But she was not the one that was troubling my mother. This woman, this spirit, I think felt threatened by my mom. And she made it very clear that she wanted us for herself, the 5 children. She coveted us. She had a thing for my dad, a real thing. She liked to touch him. And she wanted my mother gone. Get out. Just get out. And I think that that's what she was seeking, is that she wanted to live vicariously again with our family. And, I don't know what the connections, the cosmic connections are. I think that they're probably pretty significant, but we don't know what they are. And maybe perhaps that's part of the mystery of life, is, what keeps us curious when we have encounters like this. In terms of the question that you asked a little earlier, I wanted to go back to that because I wanted to share my perception. I don't believe in the veil. I think that that's a machination, literally a fabrication of humanity to explain away the otherwise inexplicable spiritual encounters that we have. I think that we are all surrounded by spirit all the time, and that some of us see it and some of us don't. Some of us feel it and some of us don't. Some of us want to and some of us don't. But that doesn't mean, in the same way that, on the night of the full moon, as it bathes the countryside in its glorious glow, no one questions whether or not there's a moon in the sky. But on the night of the new moon, you can't see it. But that doesn't mean that you think it's not there anymore. I think spirit is very much like that, just because and as my mom's already said, when we lose someone that we love, she said, there's no need to mourn them. They're not really gone. They're just, right around the corner. They're just right here. They're right here. You just, and you have those momentary glimpses into the realm from which we come and will inevitably return. So, I think that was that philosophy that got us through the death of our sister, April Helena. And I think it also goes a long way in explaining what happened at that farm and the experiences that we had. But there is no veil, at least in my experience, there was no veil at that house. And in fact, when the Warrens showed up, my mother had no idea who Ed and Lorraine Warren were. She had never heard their names. She didn't know anything about what they did. Nothing. We had an inexplicable visit from a couple of teenage brothers, Keith and Carl Johnson, in August of 1973. My mother to this day does not understand why they came to the house. They said she called them. She said, I didn't call anyone. You know, so I think that there was some influence, there was some spiritual influence going on to drag them into the scenario. I think that everything happens for a reason, but after the experiences that they had at the farm, Keith Johnson went to a seminar that Ed and Lorraine Warren were doing at the University of Rhode Island, and they're the ones that told the Warrens about what was happening at our house. And they came to the house like 3 months or 2.5 months later. They came the night before Halloween in 1973. And Mrs. Warren said later that the reason that they waited so long was not because it didn't work with their schedule or anything, you know, for the drive. It was a bit of a drive from Connecticut. They were in western Connecticut. But it wasn't that. She said that they waited to come when they thought the veil would be the thinnest. And my mother just said, there's no veil. Anything can happen in this house, any time of day or night, any time of year. It doesn't matter when it is. Now, interestingly, the spirits always behaved themselves around the holidays. I can't ever remember, nobody in the family can ever remember having any upheaval, any kind of, you know, shenanigans going on at Christmas and New Year, and right from like Thanksgiving to New Year's. It was always very peaceful, very quiet. It was almost like they were enjoying the holidays with us, and nobody wanted to rock the boat. You know, I always had a sense of their presence there, even when there was nothing visible. But it was hard, very hard to see my mom suffer, because my mother really went through a lot in that house. My mother was physically attacked a number of times. Out of nowhere. I mean, beaten with a heavy coat hanger, like beaten and bruised and bloodied all around her neck and her shoulders. She was stabbed in her own garden with a tomato stake right in the side of her hip. That could have been a life-threatening injury. It was so bad. She was impaled with a needle in the back of her leg, or what she thinks was a needle. It left a very marked hole that was very deep, that went all the way to her muscle. You know, I mean, so my mom had some stuff to deal with in the house, and it wasn't that I felt threatened. I was concerned for my family. I was concerned for my sisters that were reporting activity that was dangerous. Yeah. There were a couple of times my sisters got stuck in trunks that didn't lock. The trunks did not lock, and yet they could not get out. My sister Christine almost suffocated. My sister Cindy almost suffocated in a trunk, a box that had no holes in it. You know, and they Cindy was thrown around. Cindy's the one. Hold on, let me have just a quick drink. Other than my mother, Cindy is the one that had the most activity in the house, the most altercations in the house. And I think that it was because when Cindy was born, she had a birth defect that had to be corrected. She had a hemangioma on her face, and it went all the way up from the side of her, all the way down her jaw, and it was just a sac just filling with blood, and it had to be addressed immediately. And she didn't survive the surgery. They had to bring her back. And so Cindy has been to the other side. And I think that's why they felt that they could talk to her. And to it's also what makes her incredibly strong. She's just incredibly strong. I mean, when I graduated from college, and Cindy had already moved to the new house in Georgia, the new farm, because she brought all the animals down, the cows and the horses and all of that, and they brought a caravan of animals down prior to when we left the farm behind in June of 1980. And so my mom and dad and my sister Chris came out for my college graduation in Pittsburgh, and Cindy moved with a family friend, moved all the animals down to Georgia. And we got there about 3 weeks later, 2 or 3 weeks later, after we finished packing up the truck and bringing our critters, the pets, came with us. And when we pulled into the driveway of the new house in Georgia, and it was a new house. I mean, it was built in the 1970s. That house was only 10 years old when we moved in. And it had floor-to-ceiling windows, kind of modern farmhouse. And when we pulled into the front yard, Cindy was standing in the front window holding a cup of coffee. And there was an apparition standing directly behind her. And my mother just looked at me, and I looked at my mother, and she said, "It's not over."
Yeah. Yeah. Once you turn a light on, the spirits know, don't they?
I can't hear a damn thing what you're saying. Sorry. I wish I could read lips, but I cannot. All right, hold on. Do you have another question for me, or can I tell you about In a Flicker? Tell you about In a Flicker? Okay. After I finished writing the trilogy, House of Darkness, House of Light, I felt like my work here is done. You know, it was the strangest thing. It was like, I've done what I came here to do, I guess is how it felt to me. It was a very spiritual sensation, but it was also, hold on, let me put this down a little bit. There. Okay. It was very disconcerting. I felt like, what am I supposed to do with the rest of my life now? I just did the most work of my entire life. I just did. 7 years to write these 3 books and publish all of this, and plus the movie, and, it was just nuts. You have spirit with you. I'm looking behind you. Did your wife
Yeah, I moved.
Yeah, I just saw a full body apparition move right behind you. I mean, unless your wife is moving around the room and creating or throwing a shadow of some kind.
She opened the door to let one of the cats was clawing at the door, so it might have been one of my cats.
No, it would have been my shadow.
My wife got up.
She can't hear.
Yeah, it was very pronounced, very pronounced. But anyway, that was fun. What was I saying? That threw me completely off. Oh, yes. Okay. All right. Now I remember. And so I kind of went through, oh, gosh. I think I went through something that women describe as postpartum depression. Like I had birthed my babies, all 3 triplets. They were out into the world, off on their own, and I had, done what I came here to do. And I started having very bad dreams, started having, I didn't want to just spend the rest of my life promoting this story, that I have a lot more to contribute to the field and to life in general. I was depressed. And I have a friend named George Lopez, George R. Lopez, not the stand-up comedian, the sit-down on his butt comedian, that one. He called me late one night. We had just come back from doing a paranormal conference, and I had shared with him what some of my fears were and my I was not happy. There was something that was so off, and he called me late and said, "Just checking in, how are you doing? And I said, about the same. And he said, well, let me tell you a story. Okay. I mean, we were just on the road for 8 hours. You couldn't tell me a story on the road? Okay, no, sure, fine. No, I think it was a 15-hour drive, that one particular, up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, if I recall. So we were on our way back when I confessed to him that I was having a lot of emotional disturbance around, finishing the trilogy. And he, for about the next 2 hours or more, he told me this incredible story. Just incredible story. Unbelievable detail. He didn't bother to tell me that he went to bed one night 28 years ago and woke up with this story in his brain and never did anything with it, never wrote it down, never shared it, nothing. It was just planted in his brain.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me the story, and after I was done crying at the end and, telling him, oh my God, George, oh my God, you have to write this down. You have to write this down. And he said, but, Annie, I'm not a writer. I'm a thinker. I'm not a writer. I said, well, I'm a writer. I now know what my purpose is. I know now what I have to do. And it's a book that I'm so incredibly proud of. It is being republished because it's set in England. And we decided to go with a publisher that had a good reach into England so that we can get the word out about it. And it'll be up. Actually, the collector's item version of it is up right now on Amazon UK, Amazon. You can get inaflickernovel.com. You can go to learn about it, inaflickernovel.com, all lowercase. But it is the most incredible story I've ever read, and I have read thousands and thousands of books in my life. I don't want to give too much of it away because, believe me, giving even a little of the story away is too much because it's an integrally woven story. It's an amalgamation of fact and fiction. There are fictional characters in it, but it's factual events, and it is the only plausible explanation for why Jack the Ripper was never apprehended.
Oh, interesting.
It is amazing. And I can sit here, and brag and shamelessly brag about this book because it's not my idea. I mean, I turned it into a novel, but this is on George. And as I tell people all the time, George made me do this. And the reason is, after he told me the story, I realized what it really meant, how from the depths of its darkness, and it is a very difficult read. It's gruesome. It is just horrific. But from the depths of its darkness emerges the light, human enlightenment. Man's inhumanity to man is fully fleshed out in this psychological drama, this murder mystery, unlike any other. And, if you walk up to anybody on the street and say, have you ever heard of Jack the Ripper? The answer is going to automatically be yes. But then if you ask that same individual if they know the names of any of the women who were his victims, you get deer in the headlights. And so, in other words, these women were victimized twice. They were lost to the annals of history, and they paid with their lives to make him infamous. And when you're done reading in a flicker, you'll know all their names, you'll know their stories, but more than anything, you'll know their hearts.
Yeah.
None of these women wanted to be out on the streets of Whitechapel in 1888, selling their souls for a roof over their heads. This was, it taught me a lot. I've been, I think that part of the reason reason that I needed to be involved with this project, and I devoted 18 months of my life to it. I mean, to the exclusion of all else. I was just absolutely immersed. George gave me a rough draft. We worked together on it, and then I took off running. I added like 150 pages to, the actual text in terms of building it and, fleshing out character development and dialogue and all of that. But we worked very closely and very well together on this project. It changed me. I used to be judgmental about women like that,
Yeah.
as I've been very judgmental about women in the paranormal that kind of lead with, instead of their brains, and I've got a real issue with that because there are some of us who are out there who are doing a lot of good work in the field, and it's not about being lean and sexy, it's about being smart, and so I've had issues with some women in the field that I think present themselves in ways that diminish all of us. And I've also, I'll admit I'm a little bit of a prude, and I think that there's a time and place for everything, and I'm into social decorum. I'm very British in that respect, very British. It's all got to be very proper, and if it's not proper, then it's just not right at all. And so I had to kind of lighten up about this and learn my way through these characters. And by the time I was done, felt a real compassion for them. They weren't doing this because it was fun or it was easy or it was a way to stay alive. Yeah. They did this as a matter of survival. And so I cannot cast aspersions, nor would I, on any of them. But I promise you, when you're done reading in a flicker, you will be forever changed, David. You will be forever changed. It is a really remarkable story, and I'm so incredibly proud of it. And we've given it a new cover, which is even spookier than the old one. It's really cool. And it should be up in about a week. Anybody that wants it can still get the prior version. I've made a few tweaks and changes to it, but substantively, nothing has changed of the story. I've just added some commas and, fixed a couple of glitches and, stuff like that. But it's essentially the same story. So anybody can, grab it. It's available for any e-reader, so you can get it for just a couple of bucks. And, oh, my God, what a journey it will take you on. And it's a real, I had to forewarn my readers because they're used to warm and fuzzy me. They're used to, the very soft way that I dealt with the subject matter of the house in which I grew up. And there are no soft edges in this story. And did George and I fight about that. Fight. I mean, thank God we did the bulk of our work, even though we only lived 90 minutes apart from each other. We did the bulk of our work on Skype because we couldn't be in the same room together because I would have killed him. All I wanted to do was just smooth the really sharp, serrating edges of this story. And he's like, nope, absolutely not. And I'd write this beautiful paragraph, this whole paragraph, describing our main character, Ethan, and kind of taking him off into La La Land a little bit. And he's like, nope, slash, burn, gone. It wouldn't even matter if I had spent 6 hours on one paragraph. He's like, nope, absolutely not. We're not keeping that. I got to the point where, it was a love-hate relationship between the two of us. And I call that working well with someone because, if that was my first collaboration with anybody, I'm a very solitary worker. Solitude is my friend. I am tranquil when I am peaceful and quiet and alone working on my writing. So to have to kind of meet in the middle with him was a challenge, but it was worth it. And I'm very, very proud of In a Flicker. And in November, I am putting it in the hands of one of the biggest movie producers in the world. And I am going to hand it to him directly because he and I are meeting in California, out in Hollywood, in November, because I'm working on 3 screenplays. I've got a 3-movie deal for House of Darkness, House of Light. So coming to a theater near you, dear, in the relative near future. You know, it takes time to put a movie together, but the real story is going to make it out into the world, and I know that In a Flicker will, because it's perfect for a film. Yeah. It reads like a movie. So those are my 4 books, and those are my 4 kids, and I'm very, very proud of them. And I so deeply appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. And, you know, we'll have to talk privately, you know, after this is over, so that we can just, you know, kind of prepare for our next visit, and I can get to listen to your fabulous accent more. But you know, this is a delight for me, absolutely a delight for me. And I know that we will meet. I want to meet your family. I want to cook for you. I want you to come to Orlando and be my guest. And we will have a wonderful time. Wonderful. I'll go to the parks with you.
Yeah.
My father won't. My father's like, oh, I'm so over that. Oh, my God, if I see one more set of Mickey Mouse ears. So, I guess, you know, I'm a kid at heart. I'm a kid at heart. My throat is so dry. Hold on just a second. Okay, so you can nod. Have we used up our time?
No, you just whenever you're ready. If you.
Okay. All right. Did you have another question for me? Is there one in my box?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go look. Oh, my nose is so itchy. That means I'm going to kiss a pool.
Type it to her then. Yeah.
How did the film The Conjuring differ from the reality of what happened? We don't have that many hours.
Yeah.
We don't. That's a loaded question. It differed in many, many ways. As I said earlier, it was conjured in the minds of screenwriters who cherry-picked from the Warrens files upon which it was supposedly based, and from my books. And then, you know, by doing a little of this and a little of that, they kind of amalgamated the 2 stories together and created a third. There are elements of the story that are true. And in the grand sweeping strokes, it's true. I think that it's fair to call it a true story, in that it covers the most important elements of the story. Good conquers evil. Love conquers fear. The Perron family endured an extreme haunting that they all survived. All of that is true. A lot of the details, not so much. My mother never played hide and clap. You know, my mother was very, very, very busy setting up a new household. No matter how many hundreds of years old the house was, it was new to us. And my mom was extremely preoccupied. And in the depths of the first winter that we were there, we played hide and seek, the 5 girls.
Yeah.
And we learned very quickly that it was much safer to get on a sled and barrel down the hill in the back of the house into a solid granite wall than it was to play hide and seek in that house. A lot of Volume 1 has to do with our discoveries of the bizarre things going on in there, being trapped behind doors that didn't have any locks on them but could not be opened. Nancy had a real problem. She was playing hide and seek with Christine and Cindy one day, and she decided to go hide up behind the chimney in the morning room off my bedroom, and almost suffocated up there. She said the smell was, all of a sudden she got ice cold. She couldn't move. Horrible, horrible smell around her. She said, I think she's the first one that described it as feeling like she was stuck in a bubble. Yeah. And that the air was literally compressing in on her. causing her not to be able to breathe, and she was trying to scream and cry, and no one could hear her. Cindy heard her telepathically, and Cindy is the one that went in and rescued her and literally pulled her out from behind that chimney. And then it was later that Cindy got in trouble in the boarding room and called for help, and Nancy, who was all the way on the other side of the house in the kitchen, heard her calling for help and went running through the house and up the stairs and couldn't open that door. That door did not have a lock on it. There was no reason that door shouldn't open and close with ease. And Cindy was dabbling in the dark arts with her little friend Lori up there, and they were doing their own little conjuring of spirits and their own little seance in there. I can promise you she never did it again. It was horrifying.
Yeah.
What happened to her. She was literally smashed, her head was smashed down onto the floor, and I mean, like splinters in her cheeks. Her hair, her long hair was twisted, like it was wrapped between something's fingers, and just twisted, and she was smashed down onto the floor. Her little friend Lori never came back to the house after that. When Nancy finally got the door open, Cindy was hysterical, screaming at her, "Why didn't you come get me? Why didn't you help me? Why did you hold the door closed when I was trying to get out?" And Nancy's like, "I was trying to open the door. I heard you from the kitchen." You know, I mean, there were some really tough things that happened in the house. And, you know, and I understand why the producers of The Conjuring were reluctant, certainly reticent to include a lot of this, because, you know, the way that one of the screenwriters, Chad and Carrie Hayes, put it to me, they're afraid. They're afraid that it's literally going to run people out of the theater. They're afraid that people are going to drop dead of a heart attack in the theater. They're afraid to tell your true story. Well, I'm not afraid to tell our true story. I've sold hundreds of thousands of books. People accept this. People, you know, and I have my critics, you know, and I have people that were, you know, all they want is a series of scary stories, and they get a whole lot more than that, and they're like, you know, I need a dictionary to read this. Well, you know, God forbid that you should learn a new word, you know, but once you do learn the definition of it, you'll see that where it was placed in the text was exactly appropriate to the telling of the story. So spare me, you know.
Yeah.
These books are for those who are ready for them. The books find them, or they find the books.
Yeah.
You know, this was not written for the masses. This was written for the people, my tribe on the planet, that were ready for this, that were ready to have their mind expanded, that were ready to open themselves to spirit, or to understand more about what their own experiences have been. And so, I offer no apologies in that respect. I mean, there are colleges and universities around the United States that teach my books as a seminar, not just for the literary work, but for the actual context of it. And so, you know, to me, that's like getting the Pulitzer Prize, you know? I mean, for it to be actually taught. There are many, many paranormal groups around America that will not let a new member in until they've read the trilogy, because they tell them that it prepares them for the work. It teaches them what they need to know in order to become a paranormal investigator.
Yeah.
So, you know, I hope that people who read this are truly touched by our story, because I don't think of it as a horror story. You know, The Conjuring is a horror story. Yeah. But it's essentially, it's a love story, you know, and love does conquer fear. The opposite of love is not hate. You know, the opposite of love is fear. And from fear is born hatred, which, of course, we're dealing with in bizarre ways around the world, not just in our country.
Yeah.
But, you know, I also think that it's the fear. I think that fear is the most important thing that we can dispel in our lives, because, and I don't understand why some people get such a thrill out of it.
Yeah.
Because, you know, this isn't, paranormal research and investigative work is serious business. It's still considered a pseudoscience, but there isn't a single existing accepted science that didn't begin as a pseudoscience. And I think that I have to agree with Nikola Tesla that it will inevitably be the merging of science and spirituality that will bring answers to us that have heretofore eluded us. But I think that it is the dispelling of fear that is my most important message as I talk about this, because we not only had to learn to accept the spirits in the house, but really in a lot of ways to just embrace them, to share the house with them, to understand that it was their house first, that we're the intruders. And it's my inherent desire to express my respect for the dead that also brings me to, you know, where I am in my life in terms of dispelling fear among people, because I think that fear holds people back. It doesn't allow us to move forward. I think that it is supposed to be a tool.
Yeah.
And we empower it, we embolden it. We give it too much control over us. And when you let fear live your life for you and dictate how your life is going to go, then that's unhealthy. And I think that too many people live a half life because they're afraid of the dark, literally and metaphorically.
Totally agree.
Now, we're all little children lost in the woods.
Yeah.
We don't have any answers. We don't know anything. You know, and one of my favorite quotations of my own is that gets used a lot is the safest assumption that we can make is that we know nothing compared to what there is to know. There are no experts in the field.
Yeah.
Anybody that claims to be an expert is fraudulent. They're either living in bad faith and lying to themselves and then consequently lying to others, or you know, they're just trying to build themselves up to be, you know, a bigger fish in a small pond. It's, you know,
very
I don't
true.
get it.
Yeah, very true.
Because I think that it's there's if my family if we're not experts in this, if we don't know, nobody knows. We lived in that house for 10 years. The Warrens came to the house 6 times over a year and a half. There were many, many things that happened in that house that they didn't know anything about. Not anything.
Yeah.
So, you know, in terms of what people read, you know, I've got a lot of different TV shows about me and about this story and these books and all of that. Anybody that's searching that wants to know more, I have 2 YouTube channels. I have a lot of different videos out. If I didn't make the video, if I'm not in the video, don't take that information to the bank, because so many people have tried to ride the coattails of this that I cannot keep up with it. You know, I don't even try to keep up with it. I can't. I don't have time.
Yeah.
But all I can tell people is, you know, the whole thing in Wikipedia, completely wrong. Yeah. I didn't put it in there. I don't know who did, but it's completely wrong. And there are lots of articles and stuff that have been written about us that are wrong.
Yeah.
If I didn't write it, or it's not my video, take it with a grain or a pound of salt.
Go with a pound.
And I'm very easily accessible. If anybody wants, you know, has a question and they want to know the truth of something, it's very easy to reach me. You know, I'm right here in very comfy cyberspace. It's so roomy. And all you have to do is just send me a message, whether it be email or on Facebook, which I consider to be like the official home of the paranormal. Yes. Everybody that's got a group has a Facebook page. Yeah. And we are all connected through Facebook. It's really great, actually. I love Facebook. Love it. But it's so easy for people to reach out to me personally. And I can't answer everything right away because I get about 150 or 200 letters a day. And I can't do it all the time. But every now and then I sit and I catch up. I really catch up. And I find that I connect with the people that I'm most supposed to. You know, that those that I have kind of a cosmic connection with. And I'm I don't espouse any particular religion, but I'm very spiritual, and I have my tribe of people that I, think, in terms of our cosmic consciousness, our connection through mind, through, one mind source, is what draws us together. And these are the people that I wrote this story for. And I really hope that it does its little bit to change the world, because this is a world that needs changing.
It is.
We're in the midst of going from, one of the greatest myths that we live with is that we exist in a three-dimensional, five-sensory realm. Nothing could be further from the truth. We live in a multiverse. We live in ultra dimensions. We live in extra dimensions. There are multiple dimensions going on simultaneously. And I really do believe that it will be the merging of science and spirituality. There will be a real revelation in terms of it will reveal to us the nature of our reality. But we're right in the midst now of making that very, very uncomfortable transition from the Piscean age to the age of Aquarius. So the Mayans were actually correct. Their calendar ended in 2012, in December of 2012. That was, according to their calculations, the end of the Piscean age. So it was the end of the world. It was the end of the world as they knew it. And this new sweeping change that is occurring globally, all has to happen. It all has to happen, whether that means a lunatic in the White House, or that means, whatever it means, it has to happen, or it would happen another way. Yeah. Because this is the wake-up call for the world. Yeah. This is a wake-up call for the world that's going on. And spirituality plays a big part in it. But I'll tell you the God's honest truth, David, and I don't know if you know this about me, but my real passion, my true love, is the one thing that I've been most fascinated by my whole life, since my first contact at the age of 13. The bulk of my research is in ufology, UFOs, extraterrestrial engagement. I love the galactic family, and the galactic family loves me, and I was touched at a very early age. I think that there's some point of correlation and integration between spirit and ETs. And I don't know exactly what it is yet, but that's what I'm working toward, and I hope to determine that before I take my last breath in this vessel. And I love them. The vast majority of them are benevolent, deeply spiritual, intelligent beyond our means of understanding intelligence, highly, highly evolved, sentient beings who are watching over us and are very, very concerned about the welfare of humanity on this planet. When you have world leaders, quote unquote, throwing around the phrase nuclear war, everybody better perk up and pay attention to what's happening here.
Scary
and
times.
Do whatever that they can to circumvent the madness.
Yeah.
We're trying to make that very, very difficult transition from 3-dimension to 5-dimension, and of course the spirits are 4th dimension, and so they're just that close, but not, so as this process occurs, more and more and more people will have spiritual experiences, be touched by spirit, by, I hate to call them ghosts.
Yeah.
It's like, no, that's Casper, no. But it's our engagement with the extraterrestrials that's the most important thing that's happening in the world. We are so not alone in the universe.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
ridiculous
Yeah.
how not alone we are.
Yeah.
And my work from the age of 13, when I had my first contact, that blew my mind. Absolutely blew my mind. I didn't know until 35 years later that I was one of thousands and thousands of people who reported seeing the exact same thing, because I had to get deep into the records to find out. And, you know, it was a flotilla of ships that moved down the eastern seaboard and then crossed over the Atlantic, made a tour of Western Europe. And when the Royal Air Force scrambled their fighter jets, they took off over the North Pole. You know about that?
Yeah.
Well, I saw that flotilla.
Oh, really?
It passed directly
Right.
over the farmhouse. Now, here's the most interesting thing about that. We could talk for hours and hours.
Yeah.
You do know that, right? You are aware. Okay. The most interesting thing about that, in terms of my perception of it, aside from the amazing experience that it was for me, was that the reports began in Nova Scotia. They ended in southern Maryland before it went across to Europe. That means close to 100 million people were beneath that flotilla when it passed over the eastern seaboard, came right down the eastern seaboard from Canada through halfway down the United States. Why were there only 10,000 reports of it?
Government.
Even if 1 in 10 reported it, or even if 1 in 100 reported it, and you know, why did only some of us see it and the rest did not? I think that the answer to that question is because only some of us were supposed to see it. So, anyway, what I'm going to do is kind of wrap this up.
Yep.
Because I feel like, you know, we've scratched the surface at least. I will come back with you anytime. I love you all. I love your listeners. I think you're all wonderful. I can't wait to get over there and meet you all in person. I can't wait for you to come here. We're supposed to connect. This was supposed to happen. I'm deeply grateful.